All right, good afternoon. Bonjour tout le monde. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui pour les sessions. I'm Dr. Mark Walker. I'm the Vice Dean of Internationalization and Global Health. And I've just realized that this microphone is set to speak to this group here, as opposed to this group here. So thank you very much for attending our Global Health Learning Network event for the academic year 2023-2024. I'd like to begin with the land acknowledgement. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. So it's a quick introduction about the Global Learning Health Network. The Global Learning Health Network is a series of collaborations between the School of Epidemiology and Public Health, the Breer Research Institute, the WHO Collaborating Center for Knowledge Translation and Health Technology Assessment and Health Equity, and the International and Global Health FISIGO. This is an accredited event, Learning Activity Section 1, defined by MOCOMP and approved by the University of Ottawa's Continuing Professional Development, CPD. You may claim a maximum of 3 hours. I thought it said 3,000 hours. I was say, boy, it's gonna be a long session. And they're automatically calculated. This 1 credit per hour group learning program meets the certification criteria of the College of Family Physicians of Canada and is certified by our CPD office. So 3 main credits. So I get the pleasure now of introducing the speakers. We have Senator Stan Kutcher from Halifax originally, Ms. Sarah Laframboise, and our moderator, Alison Krentel. So a little bit about our speakers. Senator Stan Kutcher is an internationally renowned psychiatrist in adolescent and mental health. He's leader in mental health research, education, advocacy, policy, services, innovation. He previously worked at the University of Toronto. We won't hold that against you. And Dalhousie University, where he was the Department of Psychiatry, the Associate Dean of International Health, and the Sun Life Financial Chair in Adolescent Mental Health. Senator Kutcher and his team at Dalhousie University led the development of a national child and youth mental health framework for Canada called Evergreen. He has conducted award-winning research into neurobiology and treatments of mental disorder in young people and developed and deployed innovative systems of mental health care for nationally and internationally. Recently, his focus is on primary care mental health interventions, mental health literacy, development in school systems and post-secondary institutions, ensuring that the best available evidence is available to all and enable rapid access to effective mental health care, essential to all of Senator Kutcher's initiatives. My goodness, you got your work cut out for you. Next is Sarah Laframboise, who's a PhD candidate. She's the Executive Director of Evidence for Democracy, leading fact-driven, nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization promoting the transparent use of evidence in government decision-making in Canada. While completing her PhD in biochemistry at the University of Ottawa, Sarah served as the president of her Graduate Student Association and founded the Ottawa Science Policy Network, a student-run club at the University of Ottawa. Campaign which has also been advocating for increased funding to graduate students and postdocs in Canada. More money for postdocs, please. My daughter's in her 4th year of biochemistry in London, and she leads the student union. She was also recently named to Canada's Chief Science Advisor Youth Panel. Congratulations, Stephanie, and is a long-term volunteer and staff at Canadian Science Policy Center. Sarah has nearly a decade of experience in science communication policy and advocacy. And Dr. Krentel, who was our recent winner of the Global Health Award. Dr. Krentel completed a postgraduate studies at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, receiving her PhD in public health and her MSc in public health in developing countries. She is associate professor of the School of Epidemiology and Public Health at the University of Ottawa, a senior scientist at Breer Research Institute, and a senior research fellow at WHO Collaborating Center for KT Assessment for Health Equity. Alison is one of the founding members and currently chair of the Canadian Network for Neglected Tropical Diseases. I have to say, as a gynecologist, I'd never heard of the diseases that you study, which are mostly in the reproductive tract, so very neglected, and thank you for enlightening me. Her research interests and expertise involved understanding and facilitating community acceptance of new health initiatives for control and elimination of infectious diseases, specifically neglecting tropical diseases, and the use of implementation research to improve the equity and effectiveness of health interventions. So thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to have this outstanding panel today, and I'm going to turn it over to, I guess, Alison.
So it's a pleasure to be here. And to those of you online, welcome as well. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here because I want to pass over to our speakers. But just to give you a little bit of run of show of what we're going for, we're going to hear first from Senator Kuchar, who's going to give us a little bit of an overview of some of the essential elements of advocacy for scientists. So whether you're a scientist or a student, or a public health professional or a medical professional, whatever you do, I think this will be important for you to understand ways that we can be interested in advocacy and how we can get more involved. And then we'll hear from Sarah, who's going to give us some examples from the work that she's doing with evidence for democracy. And then I'm going to give you an example from neglected tropical diseases. So we're aiming to give about 30 minutes, hopefully 20 to 30 minutes of discussion. So get your questions ready because we want to have time for that. So just as a reminder, our learning objectives for today comprehend the multifaceted role of scientists as advocates in Canada, and understand the importance of evidence-informed public policies, and also strengthen the understanding of advocacy strategies and how to build relationship with decision makers. And we will be referring to a document, which I have a copy of, and I think in Sarah's remarks, she'll speak more about that. So let me just, so what I'm going to do is hide this because it's really, excuse me. There we go. Okay, excellent. So what I'm going to do is pass over the microphone to Senator Kuchar. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison, and thank you all for being here. I wanted to start with just a little anecdote. But before I do that, I'll just tell you all that I'm going to share with you now. I actually only learned in the last 6 or 8 years. And I had been struggling to get my voice heard in this complex political process. And thanks to Evidence for Democracy for putting together a document that I hope you will read. It came out of a discussion Remy Curion and I had. He's the chief scientist for Quebec. We realized that scientists and clinicians didn't have a roadmap for advocating. When I was in Nova Scotia and I was head of the Department of Psychiatry, I had regular meetings with the Minister of Health, trying to move the needle forward on improving access to equitable care and substantive care for people with mental disorders. And the minister kept saying, Stan, you're on my priority list. I had about 4 or 5 meetings like that. Nothing happened. And finally, I said to him, Jim, take me off your priority list. He said, what? I said, yeah, put me on your funding list. Because that's what we're trying to get. Now, that document is that Sarah will talk about is good. It has quite a bit of important information in it. So I only focus on 3 things. Before I do that, political decision-making, and I'll focus on the federal. Political decision-making is hugely complex. At any point in time, a person who is nudging the ship of state, that's what it is, who is nudging the ship of state has got a gazillion competing interests on a particular topic all the time. Some of those interests are extremely well organized, very, very well funded, and know their way around the political tree. Others are just like us, not well organized, definitely not well funded, and are trying to move our way through pathways that have been greased, and I use that word appropriately, been greased, but we've not been part of the grease. All right, so that's the reality, and it's a crucible. And that reality changes quickly, depending on how far away the election is, depending on what the opposition is saying about you, depending on what your crass political calculations are at a particular point in time. Do you need to win the 905? You take rural Alberta? Those are all the calculations. The first issue is, who do you speak to? There are people on the Hill who have expertise in specific areas. You've got to have them on your side. There are people on the Hill who will champion the cause because of personal, family, or friend connections. You've got to have them on your side. Thanks to fantastic work on the Parliament side, the House of Commons now has a committee on science and technology. First time ever in Canada's history, first time ever. And they're starting to make their voice heard, which is great. We still don't have that in the Senate. We're trying to look at options for committees. I'm now been appointed to the Rules Committee for some sin I acquired in a previous life. So you have to find the champions. You have to find them in the House of Commons, and you have to find them in the Senate. Because those are the people you have to build a relationship with. You get to know them. It was because of Allison's work with me, building that personal relationship and her getting my interest in neglected tropical diseases, although I'd worked for decades in sub-Saharan Africa, that actually led to the funding to deal with trachoma blindness. It was that personal relationship. You have to have that. If you don't have it, you're not going to get anywhere. And it has to be long-term. The second thing is, what is it that you're going to say and how are you going to say it? Whether you're doing face-to-face, whether you're in the mainstream press, or whether you're on social media. The messages have to be very simple and easy to understand. Canadians understand sound bites. They do not understand nuances in policy. Axe the tax. Oh yeah, good idea. What does it mean? We have no idea. We're not ready. Oh yeah, we're not ready. What does it mean? I don't know, but it sounds good. So you have to be able to put your ideas forward in a way that people will both understand and will resonate with them. Now, remember that most of the people who are sitting in Parliament, the House or the Senate, do not think scientifically. They're not scientists. They haven't been trained to think scientifically. When scientists change their mind on something, we do it because the corpus of evidence has built up enough that it changes our gestalt, it changes our perspective, it changes the way we look at things. If you've not read Kuhn's Structured Scientific Revolutions, I think you should read it. That's how we do it. And that's why our recommendations change. They're not the same all the time. They change because they're built on good science. So we thought this was the way that we did it, but now we find it's this way. So let's move it to a better way because we have good evidence to support it. In politics, people change their minds about what they're doing, not because of scientific data, but because maybe it's going to be better in the next election. In science, when we say we change our mind, we think that's for the better. The public thinks you're flip-flopping. We have a lot of education we have to do. Science communication is fundamental. And the last point I'm going to make is, how long are you saying it? I think the myth of Sisyphus was developed by an Athenian politician. Because that's what it is. Every day you get up and you roll this rock uphill, you go to sleep and you wake up in the morning, it's at the bottom again. And you go down and you just do it all over again. That's me. And I have an incredible staff that works with me. Amy McKay, my director of parliamentary affairs, is here. She lives this every single day. Wake up in the morning, roll the stone uphill again. Go to sleep, it's at the bottom. Start all over again. The process that it takes to get legislation through is arduous, it's complex, it is prone to political manipulation. And if you think, and this is what I thought, and I was wrong, that simply sitting down with people and saying, you know, this and this and this, it's obvious. Oh yeah, it's obvious. Forget it. You've got to be there for the long time. It's the difference between a marriage and a one-night stand. That's what it is. And if you're not there for the long time, you're not going to make a difference. And be prepared to fail over and over and over again. Been working with Sarah and her team. How many years? 3 years?
At least 2 years.
How many times have we talked to people who hold the purse strings? How many letters have we written? How many events have we done? And what have we achieved? Ditkas. Are we going to stop? No. Okay, but if you think that just because you understand and it's obvious and you've told the politicians that it's so clear and so obvious that they're going to change their mind or do something different, you got to be there in the long term. So I'm glad I made you all feel happy this morning. And I look forward to our panel discussion. Thank you so much.
Now I feel pressure to change to a positive light here, but I'm not too sure I'll do that. So thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to discuss this with you all. I am coming at this from a lens of I work 2 floors up in the 4th floor. I'm in the lab these days doing some revisions on a paper, so I am still an active grad student, very close to the end, but I've recently taken over the helm at Evidence for Democracy. So I've been in this role for 2 months now, so it's relatively new. But I'm really excited to apply kind of the experience that I've had in advocacy, and I'll talk a little bit about what that's looked like. But I'm going to start with a bit of an overview about Evidence for Democracy, what role we've played, the advocacy toolkit that we created, and what that looks like. So Evidence for Democracy is the leading fact-driven, nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization that's promoting the use and transparent use of evidence in government decision-making. And we do that through 3 key mechanisms. We do it through original research, we do it through campaigns, and then a lot of training and resource development for scientists and researchers. Now, does anyone recognize this image or know when this image was taken? Any hands? Recognition? Yes.
It was during the Harper years, and we called it an evidence-free zone in Canada.
Yes, yeah.
Bureaucrats were not using evidence, and they were not allowed to reach out.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, so this was called the Death of Evidence March, which was in 2012. And it was really in protest of the inability for scientists working for the federal government to be able to speak out about science and research. And so this was the origin story of my organization. The co-founders of Evidence for Democracy were part of the organizers for this rally. And this was one of the first times we saw science take a stand politically. So it was, I like to think about it as a kind of step in the right direction for scientists to take a larger role in advocacy. And again, at this time, about 90% of federal scientists felt that they couldn't speak out freely about to the media about their work. And there's, I mean, lots of cases going around Canada of kind of libraries being destroyed, books being thrown out. And so there's a bit of a visual element here of kind of the putting aside of science and research as an institution in terms of what value it can give to the government and policymaking. So what's happened in the last 10 years? Shortly after this Death of Evidence March, we saw the election of Prime Minister Trudeau. So we had a Liberal government come in after Stephen Harper. We saw the election of a chief science advisor. We had a minister of science. And then later that there was a bit of a disraveling of that role in itself. But we had the creation of a scientific integrity policy, which allowed and put into writing what government scientists were kind of allowed to do and speak about in their research. Over the last few years at Evidence for Democracy, we've done some analysis on the Standing Committee for Science and Research. So we've been kind of actively trying to evaluate what happens in those committees. We've also been following things like the Fundamental Science Review, which also came out of the new Liberal government and was led by David Naylor. And more recently, there was a similar report came out last year called the Bouchard Report, looking at kind of dissecting the research support system for science and research as a whole. I might move on and just save some time here. In terms of research at E4D, I won't delve into this a lot, but I do want to bring it up because it sets a narrative for why advocacy is important. So some of our research projects at Evidence for Democracy are up here. So the first one at the top is Evidence in Action. This was an analysis of parliamentarians' ability to access information and evidence. And what we saw in this results here was really an overwhelming amount of information going through parliamentarians' offices. And this made it really difficult for them to decipher unbiased, reliable, and credible information. And so what we really kind of took out of this report, and we did a lot of consultations following this with government officials and offices, and the idea of relationship building, as Senator Kutcher mentioned, is so paramount in this discussion. And it really was, in cases where there was abundance of information coming through, parliamentarians went to people that they had as trusted sources. They went back to the people that they already had relationships with to be able to understand that evidence that was coming through their offices. We've also done our Eyes on Evidence series, which is evaluations of transparency of evidence in research, or in policymaking, sorry. And this really kind of delves into how can the public access evidence and the process of decision-making. So when a policy is delivered to the public, how accessible is the evidence that went into that? And we took that a step further last summer and did some public polling on whether the public actually was interested in seeing that evidence. Is there a role of evidence to play in public trust and things like this? And overwhelmingly, we saw in that survey that the public really does want to see evidence, and they want to see how and why that was used in a policy decision. So I bring this up to set a stage here for why advocacy is really important. Canadians really value evidence, not only as an input for policy decisions, but they also want to see that evidence. They want it to be transparent. And I mean, the underlying factor of all of this is that we all benefit when governments make policy decisions that are informed by the best available evidence. This is a part of our democracy in a sense. It sets the stage for accountability. It sets the stage for good decision-making that is, like we said, based on evidence. So this sets the stage for our essential guide to science advocacy. And I've put the QR code there if anyone's interested in accessing it. As Senator Kutcher mentioned, this was a collaborative project that was brought to Evidence for Democracy from Senator Kutcher and Dr. Remy Caron from he's the Chief Science Advisor to Quebec. And we really wanted to delve into some tools and resources to provide to scientists and researchers to kind of take that first step into advocacy. What does that look like? Why is it important? And why should you take that step? So why should scientists advocate? As I mentioned, we have an environment now where the public really has that desire and want to see evidence. They want it to be included in decision-making, but it can't happen without relationship building. So we need more facilitation of relationships between the scientists and the policymakers in order for that bridge to happen, and that's kind of the essence of why advocacy is important. Oh, there's been some formatting errors there, sorry, but the important thing here to know as a scientist, because it's really easy to think that if we go out into the world and we tell someone something, that it will automatically create a change in that person's belief system. And we feel the same way about policy. We think, okay, one meeting with a policymaker, here's my evidence, here's my research. I can walk away now and know that they're going to do something with that. And that's not the case, right? We know that our system is set up quite complex and it's highly nuanced. A policymaker, for example, is getting multiple forms of evidence coming through their offices, but they also have a lot of other pressures coming down from the top as well. There's political powers and nuances to balance. So not all the time is evidence translating into a tangible policy. In fact, this is even more complicated because we don't just have single policymakers. We have people who group on committees, we have senators, we have people who are in multiple parts of government, and not each single person is creating a policy. This is collaborative efforts, and each of those individuals will have different mechanisms of evidence coming through their offices. So it's heavily nuanced, But this is the reason why we have a democracy. It's so that the people that we elect as officials are put into those positions to make those decisions. And so that's kind of that kind of balance there, right? Of you have to elect people who you trust to take all of those multifaceted ways of evidence coming through and create a decision. So Senator Kutcher also mentioned we need more champions of science. And this is really a message that I'm trying to push forward with Evidence for Democracy throughout the rest of this year is to be open to opportunities, be open to public policy, be open to talking to media. If you get emails asking for your expertise, answer them. These are small ways that you can take a role in advocacy that are a bit less like going out and meeting with an MP, which is also great, but start small. Start with something that is just responding to something or an opportunity that comes to you. Come and speak on a panel or something like this and engage with policymakers and people who are outside of your expertise. If you go through our toolkit, there's lots of other ways that you can bridge into that, but I wanted to just highlight a couple. I also wanted to note that it's difficult to make the first steps into advocacy. As a graduate student, if you would have asked me 6 years ago if I would be speaking on a panel with Senator Kutcher or having meetings with Minister Champagne and Freeland, I would have thought you were crazy. It is a slow process and it takes kind of taking that first step. Like I said, I was involved in student government early on, and I really kind of took this step by step as it appeared to me. I started kind of advocating for graduate student stipends and postdoctoral support early on in my graduate degree about 6 years ago. We were trying to change stipend levels here in the faculty. This then brought me to central administration and some discussions there. We then kind of opened the door to federal government and regulation of scholarships and fellowships there. I've also done work with the provincial government and things like this. So what I'm trying to say is that it starts small and it just starts by taking a stance on something that you really believe in. And as long as you continue to push that boulder up the hill, you'd never know where it's going to be, but it is a long process. Like I said, I've been doing this for almost 6 years and at the federal government for almost 3. And like Chris also said, nothing's changed yet. So it's also accepting that failure doesn't mean that you've actually failed at the cause. In the last 2 years at Support Our Science, we've really created a narrative and a story about graduate students and postdocs. And that is the legacy that I will leave with that cause. The legacy I leave won't be a win at the budget. I've stepped back from that role 2 months ago, but the legacy that I hope to leave is really a engaged student body and researchers who care about advocacy. This is the last slide. I wanted to show also a very creative way to engage with policymakers. And this is one of our followers at Evidence for Democracy. She really wanted to meet with Stephen Fleece, so she wrote his name on an agar plate with yeast, and she actually did end up getting a meeting with him through this tweet. So my last call to action here is to be patient, be consistent, and be creative. And I think there are so many unique ways to engage with policymakers that we can talk about some of them in the discussion, but I'm happy to kind of share that. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So just before we move to our panel discussion, I'm going to give you an example of advocacy that worked, so that you can see that it can have an impact as well. So I'm going to be speaking just for 5 minutes. I wanted to share this example with you from our work in the Canadian Network for Neglected Tropical Diseases. We are about 5 years old and represent over 260 individuals and over 10 organizations. And why the network is so important is that I realized when I would meet with people, it was just me. But when you can say, I represent a group of Canadians, it becomes much more powerful. And all of a sudden your voice is not just my voice, and which is, is not as powerful. But when you have more people behind you, you carry more weight. And so that we quickly learned that it was important to share who the Canadian Network was and how diverse it was and how it was across Canada. So we support the WHO's roadmap goals for neglected tropical diseases. I put this up because I'm talking to a medical academic audience. But NTDs are diseases of poverty and inequity. We're 21, which is a real advocacy challenge to meet with people and say, I'm interested in talking to you about female genital schistosomiasis. Wow, how to turn somebody into like zone out, or schistosomiasis or onchocerciasis. The names, unfortunately, that we have in NTDs are not developed for good branding. They are super complicated. So we have to be very simple in the language that we use. And they are diseases of poverty and inequity. And that is one of the major selling points of NTDs. And that they affect 1 in 5 people living in the world today. And so those are 2 really great sound bites that I can use when I talk about NTDs, because if you really get into the nitty-gritties of these diseases, you can quickly lose your audience. So the Canadian Network for NTD works for these 21 diseases. And the one I'm going to talk about today is blinding trachoma. And I put up more medical information probably than some of you may care to know, but it is the leading cause of, the leading infectious cause of blindness in the world today. So it's prevalent in 42 countries. You can see visual impairment of almost 2 million people. So it's a disease that affects predominantly women as caregivers and their children. So, you know, the images you see of children with flies in their eyes and around their faces, this is how trachoma is transmitted. And you can imagine when someone becomes blind, their life changes dramatically. But before that time, they can live in a lot of pain and discomfort as the infection affects their eye. So when I initially met with Senator Kuchar, we thought, what could we do? What's a good thing that Canada might be interested in for neglected tropical diseases? And trachoma really fit the bill in a lot of ways. Canada had signed a global policy document called the Kigali Declaration, and they committed, Minister Sajjan, who was the Minister for International Development at the time, Global Affairs Canada, in his remarks on a global stage said that Canada is committed to supporting NTDs through primary health care, particularly for the health of women and girls. So we had this policy hook. Canada had signed on to something. Now we needed an investment to support that signature. So trachoma was interesting, predominantly affects women and children. It responds to Canada's current policy for overseas development assistance, which is the FIAP, or the Feminist International Assistance Policy. It corresponds to the Sustainable Development Goals, another agreement that Canada supports. We can quantify the impact. And this is really important because we need to be able to demonstrate to Canadians, this is what your money has done, right? This is the way we've changed made lives better for people somewhere in the world. And that is particularly important if you're interested in the Auditor General's report from last year, which was pretty devastating in what it wrote about how we measure impact of some of our overseas development assistance. So the trachoma investment was important because we could actually measure how many people we were preventing blindness for. The Americas region, we're in the Americas. Canada's a member of PAHO, supports PAHO. There'd been a lot of investment made already. We just needed a little bit of money to get it over the finish line. We weren't looking for $100 million. We just needed a small investment that could help us to really close the deal on trachoma in the Americas, which would give Canada this big celebratory win, right? So would Canada invest? So really throughout 2022, lots of events. The gentleman here, Dr. Sose Fall, is the current director of the NTD program at WHO in Geneva with the chief scientist, Anthony Solomon. We wrote a piece in the Hill Times. We did a lot around World NTD Day. We had social media engagements. We had a reception at Parliament. We met senators through roundtables, et cetera, raising the profile of investment in NTDs. A little money can go a long way, and talking about trachoma. So in September this year, Canada announced their commitment of $15 million to PAHO to support the elimination of trachoma in the Americas. And it was announced as part of, Prime Minister Trudeau announced it in New York at the United Nations General Assembly. We were, of course, over the moon that this was going to be put forward and that we could celebrate the win of the PAHO and investment from Canada. And it will help over 4 million people to not become blind from trachoma. So in 10 countries, so pretty significant investment. So what did we learn? The importance, and this is like, we didn't plan our final slides, but we could have actually the same thing. The importance of champions. For me, it was the right mix of people in key positions. So it was working also with Global Affairs Canada and colleagues there, civil society, our senator colleagues in the MP, people in the right place at the right time. And that was really important. We also had a lot of opportunities for public facing events where there was a global stage or Canadian stage where we could raise the initiative. I used the Energizer Bunny, not Sisyphus, so I guess it would be the same. You really can't stop. And that's what I learned. You know, you just can't stop. And so I sometimes think of the Energizer Bunny, it just keeps going. So just to end on a kind of positive note, that advocacy, it can work and we can make policy change and through partnerships and collaboration. So it was a pleasure for me to be part of it and definitely a career highlight to have been able to do that. So with that, what we'll do is I'll invite Senator Kutcher and Sarah to come here. And we've got a good kind of 20, 25 minutes for discussion and questions. So please, so get your questions ready and we will bring the microphone around. Thank you. If people in the audience, and I don't know if we'll be monitoring online. So thank you both. So while you all are thinking of questions that you want to ask, I'd like to start with you, Senator Kutcher. You have a very unique position, having been an academic and now in government. So you can kind of understand both sides of that, of the advocacy story, which you shared about in your remarks. I wonder if you could just give us a sense of what surprised you most, you know, in your role as senator, looking back at, you know, advocacy and what kind of needs to be done.
And thank you for that very easy question and one that won't put me on the hot seat. Actually, what surprised me the most was the lack of rigor in public policy discussions, where the need to look, as you said, Sarah, for the best available evidence is subsumed under what is best politically. I can remember one of the first weeks that I was in the Senate, and I was asked to look at a Senate report that was in draft stage, not from a committee I was sitting on, but because I had specific expertise in the topic the committee was looking at. And when I read the report, there were substantive errors in the report based on clearly available data, some of it even available on the Government of Canada's website. I pointed out to the committee that there were errors in the report and I showed them the evidence. The response was, that's what the witnesses told us. So that's what we have to put in. That to me was just like a thunderbolt. And I've had to learn that the political process is not like cross-examination in a courtroom, where you can actually challenge what the witness is telling you. And we're starting to have those discussions about how can you fact check? How can you ensure that what you're hearing is not one piece of information? Like, we all know about this, all of us who are scientists, There'll be 20 papers, 19 will say X, one will say Y. This is not uncommon, it's very common, especially with predatory journalism and everything else now, right? But if that one that says Y fulfills a political agenda, the person with the political agenda will say Y. Ivermectin story. Perfect example of that, right? So that was what I found most problematic, was that the politics of the situation overrode the desire to find what the best available evidence was.
Which kind of leads me to my question for Sarah, which is, it's discouraging what you're saying. And it means the role for organizations like Evidence for Democracy and scientists is really important. And I'm wondering, Sarah, and this is not a question I sent you beforehand, so I'm going to give you, but I'm just thinking about the increasing polarizing environment that we live in. And so how do you, in the organization that you're representing, how do we make sure that evidence doesn't get polarized, or get politicized? And what, can you help us as advocates or scientists to make sure evidence doesn't end up, or what do we do?
Yeah, I mean, since, we had the Liberal government come in post-Harper days when I think many scientists welcomed kind of the rhetoric of being more evidence-informed. But I think evidence-informed policy also has become a bit of a buzzword as well. So I think it's a balance of notion for intent, but also implementation of what evidence means to a certain political party as well, right? I mean, over the last few years, I've met with MPs and senators who represent a variety of different groups. And I think evidence is something that most parties can get behind. And actually, they do like evidence and they like it. They just have different definitions of what it is. So I think the education side is maybe where I would land on about understanding what good evidence is and what credible evidence is. And as you mentioned, like evidence can be weaponized a little bit depending on the political motivations. So providing or asking for more than just evidence, maybe it's also asking for where did that evidence come from? And I think that's where transparency comes in, because if you can see the evidence, you can also critique the evidence that was used to create a decision. And in most cases, we kind of try to push for folks to look at a variety of different sources of evidence as well, and not just rely on one source of evidence to back up a claim. So yeah, maybe I'll answer it with that notion of just being critical of different types of evidence and providing different views as well can go into that. But yeah.
I think that's so important, Sarah, because very often to people making political decisions, evidence is the number of people that talk to them. So if there are 100 people who think X on the topic and 99 talk to the decision maker, but that's the wrong perspective, and there are 100,000 on the other side and 2 people talk, they listen to the 99. And it's learning how to use the language. It's emotional language that politicians respond to primarily, like all of us. We're all the same. The cognitive it kicks in after the emotion starts. That's my neuroscience background. That my team just took out this whole chunk in a speech that I was going to deliver, where we'll deliver next week, where I talked about area under the curve analysis. They said, take that out. No one's going to know what that is. They're absolutely right. They don't care what that is. They don't know what it is, right? They can't tell the difference between absolute and relative percentage. But those are the kinds of messages, basing it on best available evidence, not just evidence informed, because evidence informed, I got 10 papers, I like this one, I'm going to choose this one, all the other 9 say the other thing. That's evidence informed. Here you have the Surgeon General of Florida. He's evidence informed.
Yeah, I'll just add one last note. Sorry. We often as scientists think that quantitative data is like the end all be all, and it is to a certain extent. But as you mentioned, qualitative and storytelling and things like this are what evokes empathy in these discussions. And so I think it's tempting as a scientist to think, okay, well, here's the stats. Why don't you believe it? But if they've had someone in the room with them who's telling them a story that is so eloquent and evokes motion and empathy and all these things, then that resonates with them as opposed to some briefing note that came across their table.
And as a social scientist, that's music to my ears because I love qualitative data. So, and we are always advocating that it is equally viewed as statistical data. Any comments or questions from the audience? Yes, please. And please introduce yourself as well.
Thank you. Sorry, I'll try not to crackle and keep this far enough. Hello, my name is Petra Heidkamp, and I work on tuberculosis for Stop TB Canada and with McGill. Thank you so much for this discussion. I think it is so, so important. And I want to build on what you've been saying and maybe ask about the active fake news and the predatory journals and the discrediting of science and the social media and the flow of information that we are having these days and that influences everyone, including policymakers, is just so large that the actual words of science are buried. And I want to understand and maybe learn from both of you or all three of you, how can we really improve the voice of the credible and transparent evidence that we have in this world? Is regulatory issues, but also kind of knowledge and education issues, as you referred to, Sarah. So
Yeah, and I think it comes down to the fact that what you had mentioned is that people don't go to scientists for information. They go to the news or they go to more public-facing things like this. So, and I mean, I know Senator Kutcher is a big proponent of science communication and scientists speaking to the media and being at the forefront of those discussions. I think the visibility of scientists, if that was to improve, I think that would help combat some of that as well. Because if we look at the data, the public actually trusts scientists more than they trust government, more than they trust many other institutions. So I think we do have a unique role to play. It's a balance because we don't want to have that trust decline. But I think putting scientists in more public-facing experiences is going to help that. Do you want to add?
Sure. Thank you for that. I agree with everything you said. We're living in a historical period where we're seeing the rise of toxic populism once again. This is the 1930s all over again. And we're seeing the political response to that with this strongman leader model. The part of the toxic populism movement is to discount expertise. And if you've not yet read Peter Hotez's new book, I would highly recommend you read it. Peter Hotez, as you know, developed a vaccine for COVID, which is freely available throughout the world and has been attacked viciously and vociferously for speaking up. I think that's one of the big challenges and problems that we all face when we speak up, and scientists, you all face it as well. As Amy knows, we get constant vituperative, threatening emails, tweets every single day. The idea of the social media network is to shut down informed, intelligent discourse and replace it with sound bites and inchoate anger. And this is a very, very difficult arena to work in. I can say one anecdote that will bring this forward. We're working on a particular topic, and I asked an expert to do an analysis of information so that we could have that information to be able to have rational discussions on a particular policy direction. This person did an outstanding job, synthesized it into 2 pages. And I said to this person, do you want me to, can I share it? The person said, absolutely. And I said, do you want your name on it or not? And the person said, no, because my kids have been threatened. Okay, so this is, and you just look at the news, we see this over and over and over again. So we're living in a historical time of incredible turbulence. But we know that if we don't speak, they will come for us, whoever the day is. Okay, so the longer we stay silent and the longer we don't say anything, we leave the playing field to people which will just be happy to take it over. So we have a moral obligation, we have an ethical obligation, we have a scientific obligation to make our voices heard, but it is really hard and it's frightening. So That's the reality. The way I think we have to deal with it is to band together, have the organizations speak. We need more scientific organizations saying these things, because you can't attack the person. You can attack the organization, but that's a non-personal entity, right? So in our scientific organizations, we need to make sure that they're speaking loudly and clearly.
And I see there's a question on the floor. I just want to add to that. I think as certainly as a professor in public health at the School of Epi, I do a whole class on health communication now. And I think I was never trained that way. And I think we need to train our students better, because I don't think just because you go to medical school or just because you do a master's or a PhD means that you can actually communicate well. Maybe you can, but I think it's increasingly becoming part of our curriculum as well, because we need to be better communicators as well in the work that we do. So to Jan, you had a question, right? Yeah. Oh, the microphone's coming, but I'll share mine. That's fine. Okay. And please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Jan Hatcher-Roberts, and I co-direct the WHO Collaborating Center for Knowledge Translation and Health Equity. And I also am an adjunct professor in the School of Public Health, where I teach global health. And I see we changed our whole class so the students can come and they want a picture with you, Stan. So after. Anyways, so my question is, I was running an NGO during the Harper times. And we had to make a decision as to whether we would support rights-based approaches or not. And Eva remembers this. And we, with Oxfam and one other organization, decided we would be quite open about supporting that, knowing that all of our funding would be cut. And it was. And we were ostracized by the other NGOs who were terrified to align with us. They would tell us wrong rooms for standing committee hearings, different times. And our board had to accept that, they had to argue, but they said, we'll accept that position at a terrible cost. And we had to find other money. So how are we now, with potential change, how are we going to build our allyships? You were saying this amongst some of the opposition people, Conservatives, NDP, Bloc, who are our allies, and you know some of them because they show up. And how are we going to ensure just speaking up doesn't always cut it, right? So what are we going to do? And how's Evidence for Democracy funded now? Through what funds? Foundation, and so you don't get no federal funding. Okay, so that's the kind of stuff you got to worry about so that we can maintain it. But I think it's preparing now for that, and how are we going to build those allies?
Thanks, Jan.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I mean, certainly during the Harper days, there was a lot of defunding of science, and it really did impact the community. But I think that we did come out of it resilient. And I would say a lot of groundwork has been placed in the last 10 years. It's not perfect, and there's still room to be improved. But I think a lot of the work that could be done in preparation for an incoming government could be safeguarding a lot of the things that did work to be changed during that time. For example, having a dedicated Minister of Science. This is something that we had lost, and maybe understanding the nuances of positions like that, or the Chief Science Advisor's office. How do we protect those types of systems that support and influence science at the government? The scientific integrity policy as well, things like this that are more tangible, things that are in writing and in policy. How can we safeguard those through the tenure of an incoming government? At Evidence for Democracy, we are nonpartisan, so we actively engage with all parties. And like I said, over the last couple of years, I've met a lot of Conservative MPs in specific who do believe in our cause and believe in science. And I think it comes down to just speaking the language of other parties as well, and finding notes of our cause that resonate with them, because I think it's a careful balance as a scientist to take the Harper days as a explicit attack, which it was in certain stances. But I think it would do us a disservice to completely polarize ourselves from them. And I think it's important to really work on those relationships at all levels, like from organizations to individuals, and not isolating ourselves proactively. I think we should do the opposite and really go out ahead of it and engage in those discussions now. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I think that's absolutely the case. You can't decide to pick winners and losers when you're an organization. We can't decide winners and losers when you're an organization. So you have to equally engage. Now, there are other ways of engaging. In a democracy, you get the government you choose. That's what you get. And there are two routes here. So policy comes from a political process from within political parties. So if you actually are committed to having a political party support science policy, you basically have to get involved with that party and try to move the policy needle within the party. The other thing is when elections come, you need to get out there and start to talk about what are the issues that are important to you, and then listen to what the candidates are saying, listen to what the leadership is saying, and then advocate on behalf of your interests, because I'll tell you, that's how everybody else does it.
I'll just add last thing is that E4D puts out when an election is called, we'll do an analysis of all the election platforms as well. So I just wanted to flag that taking a look at those election platforms and understanding what's in writing for their goals for science is also a way to educate those voting kind of scenarios. So I'd encourage you to kind of keep that in mind. Yes.
Let's go there off, find out what you can do to volunteer in days of action. And then be there to get out the vote. Every single vote, it absolutely has to happen. So, I mean, first of all, find out who your MP is.
Yeah. Right? And ask them about science.
And then come.
Yeah.
So I know we have 2 questions left, but we're actually at time. So maybe what we can do is just, we'll close formally, and then maybe if there's, I know some people may have to go on, but I would like to say thank you very much to Senator Kutcher and to Sarah Laframboise for a wonderful panel. And for enlightening us with real stories, encouraging us, and hopefully for everyone in the audience today, online or in person, I would really encourage you. The link to the guide is in the invitation for the meeting. So please download it and look at it. It is very practical, it's not long, and it's a wonderful resource that can be used. So I would encourage everyone to have a look at that. And on behalf of the university, thank you both for your time today. And thanks for coming. Great. Thanks, everyone.